Did you know Mongolia is often referred to as the land of blue sky due to its vast and clear skies with over 250 sunny days per year? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about the art and culture of Mongolia with Dr. Orna Tsultem on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll discuss Buddhist and Mongolian art with Dr. Orna Tsultem. But first, a trivia question. How populated is Mongolia? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Orna Tsultem on the show today. Dr. Tsultem is the first Mongolian curator active in the field since 1993 and a leading art historian with an astounding depth of knowledge in global contemporary art and Asian art. She is currently the chair of international studies and associate professor of art history at the Huron School of Art and Design, Indiana University, Indianapolis. Her latest curatorial project in Venice highlights Mongolia's distinct artistic tradition and is a response to the ongoing exclusion of Mongolian art from Western institutions. Welcome to the show, Dr. Tsultem. It's great to have you here.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here too.
What's the most unique thing about you?
So one unique thing is probably that I was born and raised in Mongolia, but I made a long trip, a long way across the ocean to come to this country to study Asian art. And I think this passion led me to exciting opportunities such as curating exhibitions and teaching art now here at Indiana University.
And I know this is asking a lot, but for people who may not be familiar with Mongolia, can you tell us where it is geographically and give us a brief overview of its unique history and culture?
Right. So Mongolia is a landlocked country in Asia, north from China, landlocked between Russian Federation and People's Republic of China. Your listeners may be familiar with Genghis Khan, the name of the emperor who once ruled the largest empire in the world, which stretched from East Asia actually to Eurasia and to Europe. And there are movies about him, of course, and all that. But historically, Mongolia was very important in terms of culture, in terms of this man, Genghis Khan, who was a real historical person. But it's also geopolitical location between the two currently very politically active and powerful entities such as Russia and China makes Mongolia also uniquely located. Also, I would like to mention that if you've seen Marco Polo Netflix series or you heard the name Kublai Khan, those are the famous Mongols who played an important role in facilitating transnational cultural exchanges across Eurasia. And today, for instance, when we travel, we have our passports to cross borders. At the time when Genghis Khan and the Kublai Khan ruled the world, they issued similar objects made of silver or gold to facilitate free travel across Eurasian steppes. And bearer of those passports, quote unquote, they were able to get free supply of horses and accommodation and food and water and stuff like that. So culture in Mongolia is based on pastoral nomadism, meaning Mongols historically and today, they are a very small population living in a very big territory. And the current Mongolian, the country is twice large as Texas, for instance. So just a rough idea of its expanse. But the population is only 3 million people. So there are many barren lands, and the diversity of the landscape of ecosystems such as Gobi Desert and mountains and prairies and steppes and lakes are very, very nice. Some of your listeners might be familiar also with such festivals, the cultural festivals that Mongolia is very famous about is horse racing. And horse racing is about kids, actually. It's small kids. They horse race small baby horses also. And it's a very long tradition that happens in July. Another festival, which was featured also in a successful movie called Eagle Hunters, is about eagle hunting in the western regions of Mongolia, where there are many big mountain ranges and people sort of hunt with eagles, but they also celebrate the tradition every year. And because of this pastoral nomadism, Mongolians also live sustainably, with very much interconnected with nature, which in some ways reminds also indigenous practices of Native Americans in this country.
And you had mentioned Genghis Khan. And as I was doing my research for this podcast, I read about the Genghis Khan equestrian statue, which is the world's largest equestrian statue, and it's in Mongolia. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and its significance?
Right. So in the past century, Mongolia had a socialist government. And during the time, there was a strict taboo on learning about Genghis Khan or learning about historical past. And so when the taboo was lifted with perestroika and democracy started in 1990, there was a big boom about learning about Genghis Khan and learning about history of Mongolia. And so part of that sort of urge, there were successful business people and political parties and artists teamed up to establish that big equestrian statue that you mentioned. And this is to not only for Mongolians to learn about their own history, but take pride in it, of which they were deprived throughout the past century due to socialist regime. And the statue was built by an artist, by a sculptor, Erdembilik, who familiar with the monumental making colossal sculptures. And it was the idea was also to build kind of a community around it. So right now, a statue sits on top a building where there's a museum, and there is a museum that shows private collections of various periods. And Genghis Khan is one of those. I see it as one of those efforts of Mongolians to learn of its own heritage. And the artists that I work with too, and I'm currently showing in Venice, they're also kind of trying to understand what was the history and who was Genghis Khan.
What initially sparked your passion for studying Mongolian art and culture? I know that you're originally from Mongolia, but were there other things that influenced you insofar as wanting to specifically study art and culture as a scholar?
I studied art history in Budapest, in Hungary. And I studied European art as art history is itself a very Eurocentric, Western-based discipline. It was founded in Italy, in Florence, and so on. I became very passionate about learning art, partly because I was born and raised in the family of artists. My father is an eminent artist of Mongolia. He's a painter. And I have two older brothers and one older sister. They're all practicing artists. I myself not artist. One day I will be probably, but I was always good at from childhood writing, learning, enjoying writing and enjoying languages. And so I ended up learning Hungarian and studying in Budapest and learning English and reading about art history. But more than ever, I think the biggest the reason why I dedicated my lifetime to studying art, and especially Mongolian art, is realizing how little it is known and seeing it around me and being so much confident in its strength and being so much passionate in the quality of professional quality of Mongolian artists in the past and in the present, and just realizing how little it is known and shown. And that sort of, it's a painful realization. And so I came to this country in 2002 to follow my doctoral studies with Professor Patricia Berger at University of California. And why Patricia Berger is because Pat showed Mongolian art exhibition at Asian Art Museum in San Francisco in 1995. And so one of these reasons that she was also very much interested in Mongolian art, I became her student, and so that's how it all began. And I study Mongolian art, but at the same time, my publications and my research and my teaching places Mongolian art within the larger conversations of, Asian art or Buddhist art or contemporary art and so on and so forth.
And you mentioned that Mongolia is situated between China and Russia. How were these very distinct cultures, Chinese and Russian, how did they influence Mongolian art, if they had an influence?
Certainly. So Mongolia, the challenging part about studying Mongolian art is that it had various periods, and there was no one simple trajectory. As for instance, when we study Italian art, then we see Renaissance, and from there it goes to Baroque and so on. Here we have some very disrupted periods because of the region had political turbulent times very often. And it's not only because Genghis Khan was the warrior, but because the entire region of Asia and Eurasia was always had political changes and transformations. And so the historical Mongolians are nomads, and current day too, contemporary Mongolians, a large percentage are still nomads. And as nomads, they were in interaction with agricultural culture of China in south, but they were also in interaction with Eurasia and with nomads who are inhabited also in the area of, for instance, Caspian Sea and Altai Mountains. Those nomads who are known as Scythians, for instance, right? And so there are many similarities of, for instance, art among the Scythians and the early art of nomads found in the territory of Mongolia today. And so I'm careful with the word influence because we're still learning how these nomadic interactions were happening through changes in the region and migration of people. Certainly, there was a two-way street of influence and inspirations. There was a lot of influence coming from China, but also there are Mongolian also influences going to China as well, which is still very little understood. But Mongolia also had much impact from Tibet and from Himalayan region. This is because Mongolia had adopted Tibetan Buddhism in 17th century onwards. And because of that, there were so many monasteries that were built, many teachers were brought from Tibet, many lineages, Tibetan Buddhist lineages were brought from Tibet to Mongolia. And so the entire Buddhist culture was shaped within the Tibetan Buddhist culture. And there's a lot of art in museums. They look like very Tibetan, but close study of these texts and of these arts show that how Mongolians were appropriating Buddhism and how this appropriation led to interesting also Mongolian distinctive styles and distinctive forms of Buddhist art.
You have been called a leading voice in the exploration of Mongolian art and its global implications. Can you tell us more about that?
I didn't know that I was so called like I think I was called as the first curator of Mongolia, introducing curatorial practice. But interesting. I believe I may have been seen as a voice in Mongolian art and global implications because, again, my research and my exhibitions, they intentionally try to have the readers and viewers to understand Mongolia as not such a remote land somewhere in Asia and still kind of stuck in this historical past of Genghis Khan, but it is a very dynamic and modern nation which is part of globalization and all the global conversations we have around neoliberalism, environmental crisis, Anthropocene, and we just passed the pandemic age. All this, of course, Mongolia was part of it. It's just Western institutions, museums have been very close to the idea of showing Mongolian art and having the viewers also see how dynamic and interesting Mongolian artists are. And so I think that effort to place Mongolia in various conversations, the spread of Buddhism in later periods, and what was the Mongolian art within that, socialism, and what was the Mongolian part of that, and contemporary Mongolian, global contemporary art, and what are the questions in contemporary Mongolian art the artists are addressing and how they're addressing. I think these are the questions my work usually deals with, and I believe that's the reason that I'm placed within the global implications of Mongolian art.
And can you tell me where the resistance to have conversations or show or discuss Mongolian art, where there's been resistance in those Western institutions to have those conversations or those types of exhibitions?
I currently have an exhibition with the title of Resistance, and it's called Mongol Zorak, The Art of Resistance, and it's showing in Venice in conjunction with Venice Biennale in Italy. But it is a resistance, it's showing four artists, Tsultem, my own father, and Badr Zorik, Urjihand, and Passenger. And this is about a tradition called Mongolian picture or Mongol Zorak. And the tradition was formed, as I am suggesting in my own research, as a form of visual resistance to socialist realism, which was reinforced as a mainstream style of art introduced from Soviet Union across socialist bloc. And Mongolia was a Soviet satellite, was part of socialist bloc, and so the mainstream culture was developing was socialist realism. But the artists, such as my father, but he had many colleagues, they were concerned about heritage and taboo on learning of Mongolian history, taboo on using Mongolian writing system, and so on, led to the concern that Mongolian heritage will be completely lost. And so they developed this Mongolian picture style, which uses Buddhist elements from nomadic, also heritage, very much subtle way to make a painting which looks completely different than your European style painting, looking completely different than socialist realism in particular. But the subject matter, very often it shows brotherhood with Soviet revolutionaries and prosperity of socialist state and so on. But the way it shows it, the style, it's completely very, very different. So that resistance in one historical moment that I'm showing in that exhibition and how it is actually continuing today. And resistance today that artists are showing is resistance against the corporate mining that so unfortunately contributing towards degradation of pasture lands and the herders' lives, and this neoliberalism and late capitalism is something that is now booming in Mongolia, and it is adding to the environmental concern across the planet, and it is supported by neoliberalist systems such as corrupted political entities. And so the four artists, they're talking about pandemic, lockdown, the concern about obsession with smartphones and being lost in the smartphone universe. And they're talking about the political corruption and environmental degradation. And so I call this as also resistance against the environmental damage. And your question about the institutions, it's about Western institutions, Western large museums, which tend to be very reluctant to take exhibitions where they don't know the artists, they don't know the culture, but instead of being inspired that they don't know and let's show them, they take on stance that, they question the viability of Mongolian art to be shown in museums.
You wrote a book entitled A Monastery on the Move, Art and Politics in Later Buddhist Mongolia. Tell us more about that work.
This is my monograph, which was based on my PhD dissertation at the University of California at Berkeley. And this is about a monastery, very interesting case where the monastery, the entire monastery with many temples and monks and monastic schools, it moved. And the entire settlement moved and moved more than 30 times. And it's an exciting case how you build a monastery, but you don't want to stay in that, but you want to move. And so I studied that and that monastery, how it built art, but the art was also built in a way that the temples were based on yurts and based on tents, so they were portable. And not only the move, but also the sizes of those temples were sort of flexible. They could be expanded and made bigger spaces, or they were also kind of flexible for different to adjusting their audiences. But also the art too, because they were shown in yurt-based architecture, they were all seen from different sides. So artists, sculptures, for instance, they are very nicely made, from seen frontally, from back, from the sides, and craftsmanship is superb. And so monastery moved between different places not because the nomads, the builders were nomads, but because there were political purges. And in 17th century, when the monastery began as a yurt, it certainly moved part of pastures and herders' life. But later it began to be continuing that movement because there were political also struggle between Tibetan schools, some of them allied with Dalai Lama institution, which is known as Yellow Hat or Gelug School. Some were not. And so, unfortunately, there was a political struggle between the teachers and between the schools in Mongolia. And to avoid, when the monastery didn't move, there was a case when the monastery was built and hidden in a very remote area, but it's still the armies found, and they burned the monastery. So it allowed the monastery continue to move and be sort of maintain that yurt and tent-based architecture. The main protagonist of my book is a teacher and a political ruler. His name was Zanabazar. He was descendant of Chinggis Khan, 37 descendant of Chinggis Khan, who built that monastery, but also he absorbed in himself the fusion of political rulership and the religious leadership. So he himself was a political ruler. At the same time, he was a very significant teacher, Buddhist teacher. He wrote many books. He built art and he built architecture. And the lineage that he brought, the lineage continues until today, in fact. And the Urga is the name of the monastery that was moving. Urga stopped moving in 19th century because it became just gigantic. It became very big. And also because Mongolia began to be ruled by Tibetan monks, by Tibetan teachers. But in 1920s, the new government was coming, and unfortunately, new purges began, and Urga was destroyed. And instead of Urga, on the site of Urga, the current Mongolia's capital city, Ulaanbaatar, was built. And so my research, my chapters talk about Zanabazar, his art, what they mean, what the style means, why they look so superb, yet they look so Mongolian, and yet they connect to other traditions of Himalayan regions such as Nepal, and how the politics influenced art, and how the political struggle within the different rulers in the region used art for their legitimacy or for building their identity. And the rulers I'm talking about is not only Mongol Khans, but also Tibetan rulers and rulers in China. And I also talk about the portraiture, development of portraiture as a part of tradition in Mongolia. And the book ends with talking about the late 19th and early 20th century, the last years when Urga was monastery and before it was destroyed by socialist government.
In addition to living in the United States and Mongolia, you've mentioned you resided in Hungary. You've also lived in Iceland and South Korea. Tell us more about your experiences living internationally.
I was very fortunate to have those opportunities. And when I went to Hungary to study art, it was my sort of beginning of a very, very long lifetime journey to be dedicated to this discipline of art history. And to this day, I remember my teachers in Hungary and my Budapest and my roommates in dorm. How we studied at the time without internet about art and how we prepared for our exams and stuff like that. So living in Budapest was very nice, and I still miss the country and the culture. The later opportunities came also because I'm a very curious person myself, and I just don't do one thing, I do various things. And part of this was also trying to understand and learn about why Mongolia is not known, Mongolian art is not known. And so I ended up going to Japan to study Asian art, East Asian art, and I studied at Sophia University. I studied Japanese language and at Tsukuba, and then I went to Sophia University to study Asian art. That was the moment when, in 1999, when I decided to switch from understanding of European art to Asian art. And meeting with a scholar, Patricia Burgo, who later became my own professor. She was doing research and she was traveling in Mongolia, and meeting with her was a very big highlight in my life. And that's when I remember I saw Pat, and I am becoming emotional. So meeting with Pat was a big highlight in my life, and just because she's so knowledgeable and yet so approachable as scholar, I always model myself after her, and I always wanted to become a scholar, just like Pat.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
I will just say a little bit about living in South Korea and Iceland that you mentioned before. So living in South Korea and Iceland was also a very interesting experience. Especially, I would like to mention Iceland. I became a faculty member at the University of Iceland, and I became the first faculty to teach Asian art there. And while I never knew anything about Iceland, I didn't have any expectations. The nature and the colors of nature, which I saw there and experienced, were very comparative to my experiences in Mongolia. And just to realize the power of nature and of environment, of ecology, that was very much, I think, a lifetime experience. And going back to your last question, I just want to mention that I continue to work as an art historian of and a curator of Mongolian, especially Mongolian contemporary art, because I this understanding that how little Mongolia is known continues to be known, even though a lifetime work is dedicated to that. I think it's something that to work for. And even though I show only 4 artists right now in Venice, I continue to work with many other artists. And one thing that I can guarantee as a professional art historian working in the field since 1990s is that Mongolian art is very highly professionally high quality, and it is only the institutions that are reluctant to show this art. Especially, I want to mention that my responsibility as a scholar is to show how Mongolian artists are sort of not only they're part of this big world of global contemporary art, but in many ways also they're preserving that artistry of craftsmanship, of painting, of drawing, of illustration, of making things with hands that I see sometimes with technology and with digital world is slowly, possibly, unfortunately, losing its ground. And so when I have the opportunity of curating, curatorial work is my secondary calling. My first calling is always research and scholarship and teaching, and my second is curatorial work. Is because I so much believe in them that I want to show them. I want to give voices to these artists. My mission really as an art historian is to give voices to this, to give the opportunity to these artists because they really need to be seen. So if any of your listeners have a chance to see Mongolian art and artists, please do so because they're incredibly talented.
And I will put a link to your website in the show notes.
Okay.
It was great to have you on the show, Dr. Tsultem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thank you.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. How populated is Mongolia? Mongolia is the world's most sparsely populated sovereign country, with a low population density of around 2 people per square kilometer. We'll end the show with something punny. What does a painter do when they get chilly? They put on another coat. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.